Hello. I'd now like to turn to a segment which I'm going to refer to as the making of the modern court and wind up with the modern court. Where are we in 2013? Who are our justices? And let's pause for just a moment. When you've studied federal constitutional law, you've come to know certain justices. You know which justices are highly regarded. You know which justices can be quoted in your briefs. You know which justices speak with special authority. It's really a feature of Anglo-American law that we care about who the judge or justice is in a particular case, and we associate opinions of particularly distinguished judges with integrity and intellectual integrity, and that leads us to cite to these particular justices. The same thing happened back in British common law. Judge Mansfield is somebody you hear quoted frequently because Mansfield was such an important formative figure for British common law. And in the United States, we refer to Holmes and Brandeis and Hughes and in modern times, people who have made great contributions. John Paul Stevens, certainly. Scalia has a distinctive style. We know when we quote a Scalia decision, we know Scalia stood for certain principles and they're important. Sandra Day O'Connor. Again, we know our federal justices and we rely on that knowledge when we write our briefs. What do we know about Florida Supreme Court justices? Both when we were reading opinions from past justices and we were reading opinions from people who are on the current Supreme Court. Most lawyers do not know all that much, but if you're going to be in the area of Florida constitutional law litigating, you ought to have some idea about who our justices have been, what their reputations are, and who you'll want to cite to when you have choices among judges to quote. Now, so the objectives of this segment are really largely practice objectives. That is, you've got to know who the judges were to have some understanding of what authority they carry when they speak. You'll find through this segment, I think, that you do not want to rely on an opinion by Justice Mccain if you can avoid it. If you find an opinion by Justice Sundberg, you may want to give it particular emphasis because he was a well-regarded justice, and so on. So this is intended to give you that background as you continue with your law practice. I want to begin with a figure who sort of towered over this period of time we're going to talk about, and it's the person for whom the main law school building is named, B.K. Roberts, Bonnie Roberts. He grew up in Wakulla County, came from a very poor background, but his connections through family with many important figures in Florida history are pretty well established, and you can find great discussion about the larger family, Roberts family, by going to a book recently published by D.K. Roberts, Diane Roberts, that now gives the framing of Florida history and context of our own family history. And the book is a book entitled Dream Florida. And I think you would enjoy that book, very humorous, very revealing about the period of history that was nominated on the court by Justice B.K. Roberts, who was appointed to the court by another great character, Fuller Warren, after he practiced law in Tallahassee for some period of time. During his time of his law practice, he became very close to Ed Ball, who was the executive officer of St. Joe which was at that time was St. Joe Paper Company, which owned enormous tracts of Florida land, over 1 million acres between Tallahassee and Pensacola, and and St. Joe and Ed Ball had large banking interest, at times railroad interest, at times other commercial interest in Florida, and B.K. Roberts is very much aligned with those interests throughout the time he was on the court. As I've said, he grew up in Wakulla County. He came to know Fuller Warren, who's from Bluntstown. When Fuller Warren was inaugurated, the person who rode in the car with Governor Warren at the inauguration was B.K. Roberts, and he was shortly thereafter appointed to the court. After Governor Kirk was elected governor, he began to recruit staff, and he recruited an extremely talented young lawyer who had been working for the Florida bar, Wade Hopping. Wade Hopping had graduated from Ohio State University College of Law, came to Florida to work for the Florida bar, was very well regarded as a Florida bar staff person, came to Governor Kirk's office to work as a lawyer and as a lobbyist. But remember that Governor Kirk's term of office involved quite a lot of suggestions for improvements in our environment. Governor Kirk recruited, in addition to Wade Hopping, recruited a wonderful person who worked for $1 a year, Nat Reed from Hope Sound, Florida, who was a great Republican who cared enormously for the environment throughout his career, still is very much involved in improvement of Florida's environment. And Wade helped spark a movement within the governor's office to bring about great improvements in water quality and air quality in Florida. And so it was the Governor Kirk's administration that put forward these great advances in environmental law in Florida, and the lobbyist for all of those was Wade Hopping. He came to be very well regarded by legislators who dealt with him. I was one of those people who came to admire Wade a great deal and applauded his appointment to the court. The second person who was appointed by Governor Kirk was, in my judgment, not quite so admirable. You see here a picture of David Mccain with an American flag. You'll see an awful lot of the characters I'll mention who are posing with the American flag. David Mccain turned out to be a disgrace to the court, and we'll describe that in a few minutes. He has his law degree from University of Florida. He was very well regarded in Fort Pierce, where he grew up. He came to be admired by senior judges and others in the Fort Pierce area, and had been appointed as a judge to the 4th District Court of Appeal. He served there for a fairly short period of time and was elevated by Governor Kirk as a member of the Florida Supreme Court. And he's a big part of the unraveling of the old court and the making of the modern Florida Supreme Court. I now want to go quite apart from the appointments that Kirk made following his 1966 election to the judicial elections that occurred in 1969, because these also are involved with the process of the transition from an old court system to a new court system. That is, when I say system, I really mean culture. From an old culture to a new culture. The old culture was clearly dominated by B.K. Roberts and others who followed the leadership of Justice Roberts. The new court system really became divorced from that culture. But the people elected in 1969 included Vassar Carlton, who was a very well-regarded judge in Brevard County, He was related to a number of people who had been involved in leadership of Florida, including the Florida Governor Doyle Carlton, who served with distinction. And he ran as a Democrat and defeated Wade Hopping. This is the first election, judicial election, I ever was involved with. And in that election, I supported Wade Hopping, who I thought was a far better candidate than Vassar Carlton. But Vassar Carlton was a decent person until he began to have some terrible personal problems. David Mccain, having been appointed, was elected in 1969, and Joe Boyd, who had no previous experience with the court and not had a particularly distinguished law practice, but practiced out of Hialeah, had been a local official, including a member of the Dade County Commission before he was elected to office. As we'll see, we begin to see some changes on the court that involve all three of the people involved in the 1969 election. First of all, Vassar Carlton retires in 1964. This occurs after reports emerged of trips sponsored by gambling interests that had cases before the court. Now, Carlton had been a very well-regarded circuit judge. He became a little bit less reliable and less stable after his wife died. And in some respects, I think he began to run with some interests that were unfortunate. At the time that Vassar Carlton was going through this, I had a client in Miami, Channel 10, which had hired a wonderful investigative reporter named Clarence Jones. And Clarence Jones came to me one time and said, "We've learned that Justice Carlton is going to Las Vegas on a trip to be paid for by gambling interests, racetrack interests, who have cases before the court, and that he's going to go on a trip to be paid for by these gambling interests. And we want to videotape in the gambling halls where we expect to find Vassar Carlton." I was horrified because there were Nevada laws that made it a criminal act to photograph people inside gambling establishments. And I was very worried that Clarence Jones was going to get himself in trouble, or worse yet, was going to get the television station in trouble. And I fought against it quite a lot. Clarence managed to get the administration of Channel 10 to disagree with me, allow Clarence to go into a gambling establishment. He carried with him a briefcase, and in the briefcase was cut in one end a little hole in which he had placed a 16 millimeter camera that would shoot out through the side of the briefcase. And so Clarence, when he got to the casino, would go to the slot machines located somewhere close to where Vassar Carlton was gambling, in company of several young ladies and another person who I believe was associated with the racetracks. And Clarence would, without looking over at Vassar Carlton, would rotate his body and pan and get pictures of Vassar Carlton at the gambling table with these young ladies. When these were broadcast, Vassar Carlton quickly resigned. So again, I had an opportunity to be on the fringes of a case, some activities that led to Vassar Carlton resignation. And following that, as we'll see, there was a merit appointment by Governor Askew, which brought Ben Overton to the court, and we'll talk about that in a second. Now, overlapping this is Justice Ervin was on the court. Justice Ervin had been Attorney General of Florida I think a very good Attorney General. He gave me my first job in state government. When I was in college at Florida State University summer school in 1954, he hired me for a high-ranking job in which I ran machines down in the sub-basement of the Capitol. So I ran machines and distributed papers around the offices of the Attorney General of Florida, but it was a very well-paying job for 75 cents an hour. And I always appreciated Justice Ervin for hiring me, but more important, for being a wonderful Attorney General and then a very well-respected judge. He had a number of dissents in which he had suggested the court rule one way, dissenting from the majority opinion, and the United States Supreme Court came along and issued its opinion, which was entirely in agreement with Justice Ervin. So he was the person who would tell the Florida Supreme Court they were going wrong. The Supreme Court did not listen, and Justice Ervin was repeatedly vindicated by decisions of the Florida Supreme Court. At Florida State University College of Law, you'll find that there's a chair that's held by the Solicitor General of Florida, who not only argues cases for the state, but teaches at Florida State University College of Law. And the chair in which the Solicitor General sits is called the Ervin Chair. And I'm happy to say that that was established during the time that I was president, and was very happy to see Justice Ervin honored in that way. But his resignation created a vacancy, and there was an election, and I'll come back to that in a second. In the meantime, there was an impeachment of justices in 1975. Now remember, we've already had the resignation of Vassar Carlton, the merit appointment of Ben Overton, the election following Justice Ervin's resignation from the court, in which we now get Arthur England on the court, and now we have an impeachment that's directed to 3 justices, all of them who were elected to the court. Hal Deacle had been elected to fill a vacancy. David Mccain, we know, was appointed by Kirk and then elected, and Joe Boyd. Of these 3, Justice Boyd remained on the court, later actually became Chief Justice of the court, a very decent human being, but he had accepted some ex-parte communications, included a draft opinion in a case that he had received as an ex-parte document. Hal Deacle resigned. Hal Deacle had also been involved in the ex-parte document in this public utilities case. Hal Deacle, again, a very decent human being. I tried at least one case before him when he was a trial judge in Dade County. But he was involved not only in the public utilities case that implicated Justice Boyd, but also involved in asking some circuit judges to accommodate Florida lawyers who had cases before them, in terms of asking circuit judges to give continuances to Dade County lawyers he'd known. And when Justice Deacle denied doing that, and a circuit judge in Panama City was willing to swear that Deacle had made that request, people believed the circuit judge in Panama City, and Justice Deacle was required to resign. Of course, the third person is David Mccain. And David Mccain is a tragic, tragic case. David Mccain was a bright student, a law student who had shown himself to have great promise, a person who had gone back to practice in Fort Pierce, had a successful practice, practiced with a very fine lawyer named Steve McAlilly, but wound up coming under the influence of some people after he went on the Supreme Court, actually 4th DCA, and then on the Supreme Court. And through that influence, came under suspicion that he had been actually accepting bribes. During this same period of time, Justice McCain began to lose control of his personal conduct, was frequently drunk, would call in from Tampa and dictate opinions from Tampa, would describe to law clerks cases that they should handle in a certain way because a certain lawyer was handling the case, and built up a reputation as a person who did favors for those people who had helped him get on the Florida Supreme Court. And as a result of that, he was subject, first of all, to impeachment. The Florida Judicial Qualifications Commission had investigated Florida Supreme Court justices, but had run out of money because they had so many matters that they were investigating. They had looked into the Vassar Carlton matter. They had looked into the Deco matter. They had looked at the Public Utilities Commission matter that involved both Joe Boyd and Hal Deco, and they'd run out of resources. And so at some point, after the JQC had made some recommendations that had gone to the Florida Supreme Court and nothing had happened, the Florida legislature instituted an impeachment investigation. And when this investigation took place, the Florida House of Representatives first hired a wonderful former senator who later went on the Supreme Court, a fellow by the name of Fred Carl, to become their general counsel for the impeachment committee. Fred became very ill. He almost died. He went to Tallahassee Memorial Hospital. There was some malpractice that led to Fred's great illness. Fred was very close to death. He had to resign. When he resigned, he had started the process of impeachment of these 3 justices, but not being able to continue, he had to drop off. And at that point, the Speaker of the House, a wonderful lawyer by the name of Donald Tucker, called me and asked me to serve as chief counsel for the impeachment committee. Now, if you don't recognize Don Tucker's name, look across from FSU College of Law, look across from Roberts Hall, and look at the structure that's across the street. It's the Don Tucker Civic Center. Don Tucker was a cousin of V.K. Roberts. Now, when Don Tucker called me and asked me to take on the job of chief counsel for impeachment, I asked him 2 questions. My first question was, is V.K. Roberts going to have anything to do to direct this impeachment? Because if he is, I can't be involved with it because it's not going to go anywhere. The reason I was asking this question was that Mccain and some of the other justices who were subject to the impeachment investigation had a close relationship with the Ed Ball interest, the St. Joe interest, and I worried that there'd be some tilting towards a position that would be dictated by Justice Roberts. And when Don Tucker assured me that that was not the case, it gave me quite a bit of relief. But I also wanted to know that the chair of the committee, whose name was Billy Joe Risch from Port St. Joe, a community that was very well known to be substantially dominated by the interests of St. Joe Paper Company. I want to know that Billy Joe Risch was not going to be intimidated by the Ed Ball interest, and that we could go forward with a full investigation. I knew Billy Joe Risch from law school. I trusted him a great deal. I knew he was a person of basic integrity, but I wanted those assurances from the Speaker. He gave them to me, and I took on the job. Ultimately, we drafted articles of impeachment for Justice Mccain. We had a resignation from Justice Deacle before I took over the case. We did draft articles of impeachment for Justice Mccain. They went before the House of Representatives, and there was a unanimous vote by the House of Representatives. Several people left the floor rather than vote against Justice Mccain, but that resulted in the in McCain's resignation. McCain resigned only after another episode that I feel that I should describe. I may describe it again in a later lecture, but there was an article that appeared in the Florida Times-Union about this impeachment, and the article quoted the then Chief Justice, Jimmy Atkins. Jimmy Atkins had been elected to the court. I always thought was a wonderful person, a person who is largely responsible for the movement of open government in Florida, particularly open meetings in Florida, and wrote a number of opinions which I greatly admired. So I was a great fan of Justice Atkins. But the newspaper article said, in quoting Justice Atkins, described how the proceedings would work because the Chief Justice would preside at the impeachment proceedings. So I had to go over to the court and say to Justice Atkins, Judge, I am sorry to be the bearer of this news, but you can't preside as Chief Justice at this proceeding. You're not going to be presiding officer. You're going to be a witness. And the reason for that is that Justice Mccain, who's being impeached because of his conduct in the resolution of this list of cases, is certainly going to use as his defense that he was sitting on a collegial court and that he could not do anything by himself, and that the result that was reached by the court was reached by a majority of the court, and that he did nothing different from what the other justice of the court did, and therefore he couldn't be. These cases could not be used against him as proof of any kind of corrupt activity on his part. And to get at that, it was going to be necessary to have not only the testimony, but the deposition testimony of justices who sat with McCain. And the first justice in seniority who had not sat with McCain was Ben Overton, who had just been appointed by Governor Askew as the first merit appointment in Florida history. And so following that, I never got a direct reply back from Justice Atkins, but what we got instead was a letter of resignation from Justice McCain. He did not want to go forward with the impeachment process. I'm convinced to this day that the reason that McCain did not want to go forward was that members of the court, including Justice Roberts and others, went to him and said, if you go forward, it's going to be very embarrassing to the Florida Supreme Court. It'll require a number of us to have to testify to the legislature, perhaps give depositions, certainly give our testimony relating to these cases on which we sat with you, and therefore it's better for the court if you resign. I got a call from Justice Atkins asking me whether I could influence the Florida bar to agree not to disbar Justice Mccain if he would resign from office. And I had to tell him that although I was a member of the Board of Governors at that time, I had to tell him that as a counsel working for the legislature, I would not recommend to the legislature any contact with the Florida bar relating to their decision of whether or not to disbar Justice Mccain. And so we made no recommendation. Ultimately, Justice Mccain was disbarred following his resignation from the court. So we now see the whole process of court reform now is put in place. And we have people who are called by Neil Mckean, a historian and journalist who's covered the Florida Supreme Court. He refers to the four horsemen of the Reformation of the Florida Supreme Court. There Ben Overton, appointed by Governor Askew under the merit selection process. Alan Sundberg, appointed under the merit selection process. Arthur England, who was elected following the resignation of Justice Ervin, and Joe Hatchett, the first African American member of the court, again selected through the merit selection process. And this now leads to a new Florida Supreme Court, a new culture of the court, and one that I believe endures to this very date. And so let's look at these other appointments that followed in turn, and we begin to see the election, first of all, of Fred Carl, who I mentioned earlier, who had been an impeachment attorney before he became ill. Jim Alderman, selected under merit selection process. Parker Lee and Jim Alderman stayed on the court a relatively short time. Parker Lee McDonald, a circuit judge from Orlando, who became a very important presence on the court. Ray Ehrlich, the first justice to wear a bow tie in modern times. From Jacksonville, a great lawyer, a partner of Senator Jack Matthews, a person with a great sense of humor. Leander Shaw, who had been on the First District Court of Appeal, the second black justice to join the court. Rosemary Barquette, the first woman to join the court. She had been on the fourth DCA. She had been before that had been a circuit judge and had been a partner of the lawyer who had been greatly influential on Justice Mccain. Sort of a great irony. Rosemary Barquette left that firm, wound up litigating with the firm about residual fees, but Rosemary Barquette turned into just an extraordinary justice and went on to be a member of the Federal 11th Circuit. Stephen Grimes, who had been a long-time lawyer at Holland and Knight, and then a judge on the Second District Court of Appeal, came to the court. Gerald Cogan had been a very distinguished circuit judge following a remarkable tenure as an assistant state attorney, a person who had prosecuted large numbers of felonies, capital crimes, had a number of murder cases, and contributed greatly to the court with his understanding of law generally and of criminal law particularly. So wonderful people following in line behind these four horsemen of the Reformation, and the court's culture, which was changed during the tenure of those four horsemen, really continued to change, and the court continued to prosper during this period of time. And we moved from these early appointments into the 1990s and early 2000s and see Major Harding, a Jacksonville judge, circuit judge, who had earlier been a county judge, appointed. Major Harding, now retired from the court and in active law practice, likes to point out that when he was a Democrat, he was appointed by a Republican. When he was a Republican, he was appointed by a Democrat. But he was an extremely fine justice. The second person in modern times to always wear a bow tie, which deserves some comment and appreciation. Harry Lee Anstead was a judge on the 4th DCA, well regarded again, was appointed by Governor Childs. Charles Wells, appointed again by Governor Childs from Orlando, was a practicing lawyer before being appointed. His practice was largely in the area of insurance defense work. And then the remarkable Raul Quintero. Raul Quintero was the second graduate of Florida State University to go on the court. Now, that puts aside people like Westcott, who were graduates of the seminary west of the Swanee, but Alan Sundberg had been a graduate of FSU who went on to Harvard Law School, and Raul Quintero was a graduate of Florida State University who went on to Harvard Law School. And again, in my judgment, became an excellent justice. And then Ken Bell. Ken Bell was appointed in 2003 and served to 2008. Again, Ken Bell is a graduate of Florida State University, and including Florida State University Law School, and served really quite creditably on the Florida Supreme Court. And now we come to the current justices. I want to return to the point that I made earlier. You know the names of the great justices who've served in our federal system. You know most of the Supreme Court justices and the names of many of the people who have been prominent on federal appellate courts and sometimes federal trial courts. But it's awfully important to know the justices who served in Florida and who are serving in Florida. And today, of course, we have 7 members of the court, and I'd like to go through those and identify them briefly, beginning with the Chief Justice. First is Ricky Polston. Ricky Polston was raised in Graceville, Florida. He was a very good student beginning at community college, coming on to Florida State University, where he received a degree in accounting. He went on to be a CPA. He was a distinguished accounting graduate before he went to law school. He then went into law practice beginning in 1987 and practiced until 2000. At that point, he was appointed by Governor Bush to the First District Court of Appeal. Amazingly, Ricky Polston has 10 children, 6 of them from one family, adopted as a group, and he and his wife are raising these kids and spending obviously an awful lot of energy outside of the court in raising such a large family. But knowing that kind of background about a justice may help you understand their position on some cases. Following Ricky Polston, we have Justice Barbara Prairanti. She was born in New York City, educated in New Jersey, went to Boston University for a law degree, for an undergraduate degree, and for a law degree to George Washington in Washington, D.C. Was an honors graduate there, practiced law ultimately in West Palm Beach, and was appointed to the 4th DCA by Governor Childs and ultimately appointed by Governor Childs to the Florida Supreme Court. She's been Chief Justice of the court in the past, and as you'll see, as you follow her arguments, very much engaged when the oral arguments are before the court. Next was Fred Lewis. Fred Lewis was born in West Virginia. He went to Florida Southern College on an athletic scholarship. He was recognized nationally by the NCAA as one of the top student athletes in the country. He went to University of Miami for his law degree. He practiced in Miami as a trial and appellate lawyer for a period of time, achieved a great distinction, handled a large number of appellate cases, and probably among the sitting justices has argued as many appellate cases as anybody on the current court. He also is a former Chief Justice. Justice Peggy Quince, born in Norfolk, Virginia, went to Howard University for a law degree, went to Howard University and got her law degree at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. She came to Florida after a brief time in Washington, began to work with the Attorney General's office in 1980, worked there for a period of time, handled a number of cases, including capital cases for the Attorney General, and was appointed by Governor Childs to the Second District Court of Appeal. She has the distinction of having been appointed by two governors. She was appointed by Childs and by Bush. And the reason for that is that her vacancy came up at just the time there was a transition from the Childs administration to the Jeb Bush administration. And so they got together to have a discussion about who should get that appointment. And they decided, well, it'd be a pretty decent thing if they both took it. So Peggy Quince is the justice on the court who got to the court through the appointment of both a Democrat and a Republican, both making the same appointment. An interesting fact about the court. Justice Charles Kennedy was appointed by Governor Christ. He was born in Lakeland. He went to Haverford College, a wonderful liberal arts school, and then to Yale to get his law degree. He was elected to the Florida House originally as a Democrat, but changed his registration, was elected then, and then elected to the United States Congress as a Republican, became a member of the Judiciary Committee in the House of Representatives. When he left the House of Representatives, he came to work for Governor Jeb Bush as a general counsel and served there until Governor Bush appointed him to the District Court of Appeal, where he served from 2002 to 2008. And then, as I said earlier, in 2008, he came to the court as a justice and was shortly thereafter Chief Justice of the Florida Supreme Court. Justice LaVarga has a very interesting history. He was born in Cuba. He came to this country when he was 11 years old. When he came to the United States, he lived in Pahokee, a very poor section of Pahokee. His father worked in a mill in Pahokee. He ultimately went to University of Florida for his bachelor's degree and for his law degree. Came back to Palm Beach County, was an assistant public defender and an assistant state attorney before embarking on trial practice as a private attorney. He was appointed to the circuit bench by Governor Childs in 1996. He was then strangely appointed briefly by Governor Christ to the 4th DCA. I don't think he ever sat on a single case there, but before he could take his seat as a member of the 4th DCA, he was appointed by Governor Chris to the Florida Supreme Court. And so he went essentially from the trial bench, where he'd been an administrative judge for the Circuit Court in Palm Beach County, to the Florida Supreme Court through Governor Chris' appointment. And then Judge James Perry, again, a wonderful background. He is a graduate of Columbia Law School, had come to Florida to practice in Florida and to work in areas of Florida that were very much subject to changes due to the emerging civil rights movement, and came to be a very well-regarded lawyer, handling an awful lot of civil rights cases and plaintiffs' cases of various kinds. Became a circuit judge appointed by Governor Jeb Bush. Notice the pattern here, that some of these justices come to the bench appointed by a Democrat and are later appointed by a Republican, or vice versa. So don't get too hung up on political parties, at least historically, when you begin to look at courts, because these courts have not been impacted by partisan political interest in the same way that some other courts have. He was chief judge of the 18th Circuit. Again, distinguished himself there, and was appointed by Governor Chris to be a member of the Florida Supreme Court, where he's already achieved great distinction. Well, that's a review of the critical period in the history of the Florida Supreme Court. If you want to look further at that history, look at the book by Martin Dyckman entitled A Most Disorderly Court. It really tells the story about this period of crisis in the Florida Supreme Court and the transition period to a different culture, a culture which was no longer under the domination of commercial interests like the Ball interest and St. Joe interest that dominated at least B.K. Roberts and a number of his colleagues. Please understand, I do not mean to disparage earlier justices of the Florida Supreme Court. We've had a number of great justices well before this period of time that I described, but it clearly was a period of time in the history of the Florida Supreme Court that was formative for the current court. And it's sort of interesting historical fact that this occurs at about the same time that we have impeachment proceedings going on in the federal government. The Nixon impeachment proceedings began to overlap with this period of dysfunction in the Florida Supreme Court, and so the Florida Supreme Court was able had to deal with an impeachment challenge of its own that was close in time, parallel to what was going on in the federal government. But in any event, in my opinion at least, the culture of the court has changed, and the Florida Supreme Court today is highly regarded throughout the United States as a court of great prestige, and a court which has been, over a period of history, an innovative and progressive court. And in my belief, it continues down that path until this day. Thank you.